October 1944. Camp Concordia, Kansas. The cattle cars lurched to a stop beneath a sky so vast it seemed to mock the borders of nations. 63 German prisoners of war, still dressed in the tattered remnants of Afrika Korps uniforms, stepped onto American soil for the first time. The air smelled of wheat chaff and diesel fuel, a peculiar combination that would forever mark their memory of arrival. They had been told nothing except that they were being transferred to a labor camp somewhere in the American interior, a place so remote that escape would be suicide. What they found instead was something far more disorienting than barbed wire or guard towers: abundance. Lieutenant Hans Schreiber, a 24-year-old panzer officer captured near Tunis, watched as American guards distributed sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, white bread, thick slices of ham, butter that hadn't been rationed into invisibility. He looked at the sandwich in his hand as if it were a propaganda pamphlet, too perfect to be genuine. Behind him, Oberstleutnant Ernst Müller whispered what many were thinking: "They're fattening us for something. This cannot be real." They had been trained to expect brutality in captivity, starvation rations, forced marches. The Geneva Convention was something their superiors mentioned only when it suited them. Yet here they stood, 15 pounds heavier than when they'd boarded ships in North Africa, eating food that would have fed a German family for 3 days. The camp itself contradicted everything they understood about warfare. Wooden barracks with coal stoves. A canteen that sold Coca-Cola and American cigarettes. A recreation hall with ping-pong tables and a gramophone. The guards carried rifles but seemed almost bored by their duty, as if guarding prisoners was an administrative inconvenience rather than a military necessity. What the Germans did not yet understand was that they were not merely prisoners. They were witnesses. And the lesson they were about to learn would prove more devastating than any battlefield defeat. For 3 years, the machinery of the Third Reich had operated on a fundamental assumption: that German industrial supremacy was both racial destiny and tactical reality. The Luftwaffe's early dominance over Poland, France, and the Low Countries had seemed to confirm this belief. German engineering, German discipline, German will. These were the pillars upon which victory would be constructed. When the first British cities burned under waves of Heinkel and Dornier bombers, Joseph Goebbels proclaimed it proof that democracy was weak, that nations built on equality could never match the focused power of totalitarian efficiency. German workers, the propaganda insisted, were the finest in the world. The assembly lines of Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf produced aircraft through Teutonic precision and masculine strength. Women belonged in the home, raising future soldiers. This was not mere policy. It was ideology as immutable as gravity. By 1944, that ideology had collided with reality in the skies over Berlin. The prisoners at Camp Concordia had all seen the silver fleets of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 liberators that darkened the sky in formations so vast they seemed like migratory storms. They had watched German cities transform into landscapes of ash. They had felt the ground shake from bombs that struck with such precision they could obliterate a factory while leaving a nearby hospital standing. The prisoners knew the names of these aircraft: Flying Fortress, Liberator, and they knew what those names represented. What they did not know, what they could not yet comprehend, was who had built them. The work assignments came within 48 hours of arrival. The prisoners were told they would be employed in agricultural support, harvesting crops, repairing farm equipment, labor that would keep them busy and generate income the U.S. government would hold in trust. But the work detail for November was different. A contingent of 30 prisoners, including Schreiber and Müller, were loaded onto trucks and driven east through Kansas flatlands that stretched unbroken to the horizon. They passed towns with names like Salina and Junction City, places that seemed to exist in a kind of temporal suspension, untouched by the war that had consumed Europe and Asia. The trucks stopped at the gates of the Boeing plant in Wichita. Even from outside, the scale was incomprehensible. The main assembly building covered 29 acres under a single roof, a structure so enormous that workers inside reportedly had difficulty remembering which direction they'd entered. The prisoners were led through a side entrance, past security checkpoints where guards checked badges with mechanical efficiency. They were told they would be sweeping floors, moving crates, performing menial tasks to support the production line. They were also told they would not touch the aircraft or any sensitive equipment. The Geneva Convention permitted use of prisoner labor for non-military work. The Americans interpreted this creatively, arguing that cleaning an aircraft factory was janitorial, not martial. It was when they entered the main production floor that the first fracture appeared in the prisoners' understanding of the war. The assembly line stretched nearly a quarter-mile, a river of aluminum and steel flowing in stages from skeletal frames to fully realized bombers. 29 superfortresses in various states of completion lined the floor like enormous mechanical insects undergoing metamorphosis. The noise was symphonic, rivet guns hammering, sheet metal being shaped, hydraulic presses compressing parts with pneumatic hisses. The prisoners had expected this. What they had not expected were the workers. Women. Hundreds of them. They wore coveralls and welding helmets. They operated rivet guns with practiced precision, their movements economical and efficient. They climbed into wing structures and fuselage compartments with the casual confidence of people who knew exactly what they were doing. They consulted blueprints, called out measurements, coordinated installations of electrical systems and hydraulic controls. Some were young, barely out of high school. Others were middle-aged, their hands rough from years of labor. They worked alongside men in ratios that seemed impossible. In some sections of the assembly line, women outnumbered men 3-to-1. Mueller turned to Schreiber, his face pale beneath the fluorescent lights. "This is propaganda," he said in German, his voice low. "They brought us here to show us a staged facility. These are actresses." But they watched for 4 hours that first day, sweeping floors and moving empty crates while the assembly line never stopped. They watched a woman no older than 25 install the entire electrical harness for a bomber's cockpit, her fingers moving through a maze of colored wires with the speed of a concert pianist. They watched another woman, perhaps 50 years old, operate a hydraulic press that shaped wing sections from flat sheets of aluminum alloy, the metal screaming as it was forced into aerodynamic curves. They watched a team of 6 women, no men present, install a bomber's landing gear assembly, a piece of equipment that weighed over 2 tons and required perfect alignment or the aircraft would tear itself apart on touchdown. There were no film crews. No staging. The women did not perform for the prisoners' benefit because the women barely noticed the prisoners at all. They were too busy building aircraft at a rate of 16 bombers per day from this facility alone. The ideological vertigo began slowly, then accelerated. The prisoners returned to Camp Concordia each evening and lay in their bunks, staring at wooden ceiling beams, trying to reconcile what they had witnessed with everything they believed about the world. In the mess hall, conversations that had once focused on memories of home or speculation about the war's end now circled obsessively around the factory. "They cannot be competent," insisted Feldwebel Otto Koenig, a mechanic who had maintained Bf 109 fighters in North Africa. "Assembly work is simple repetition. A trained monkey could install rivets." But Schreiber, who had studied engineering before the war, shook his head. "I watched them troubleshoot a hydraulic system failure. The section leader was a woman. She diagnosed it in 6 minutes, a pressure valve malfunction in the landing gear bay. I've seen Luftwaffe maintenance crews take an hour to find that problem." The other prisoners fell silent. It was one thing to dismiss women as factory labor, performing rote tasks under male supervision. It was another to acknowledge technical competence, problem-solving ability, leadership. The distinction was not semantic. It was civilizational. If women could build bombers, if they could do so efficiently and at scale, then what did that say about the ideology that had insisted otherwise? What did it say about the war itself? The prisoners began to notice other details. The factory operated 3 shifts, dawn, day, and night, to maintain 24-hour production. Between shifts, the prisoners sometimes saw workers arriving or leaving. Many drove their own automobiles, vehicles that would have been luxury items in wartime Germany. They chatted with each other in the parking lots, smoking cigarettes and discussing production quotas as if they were routine business rather than the machinery of total war. Some carried lunch pails decorated with their children's drawings. Others wore lipstick and had their hair styled in the fashion of American movie actresses. They were not drones or slaves or desperate laborers driven by fear. They were citizens participating in industrial mobilization, and they seemed to be doing so voluntarily. One afternoon, during a water break, Schreiber found himself standing near a group of women who were reviewing a technical schematic spread across a work table. The document detailed fuel system modifications for extended-range missions, the kind of classified information prisoners should never have been able to glimpse. One of the women, a brunette in her 30s with oil stains on her coveralls, noticed him staring. "Can I help you?" she asked in English. Schreiber's English was functional but accented. I am sorry. I did not mean to, he gestured vaguely at the schematic, unsure how to explain his astonishment. The woman smiled, not unkindly. You wondering how we manage all this technical work? Her tone was matter-of-fact, without condescension or triumph. Schreiber nodded, unable to articulate the deeper question beneath the surface one. Most of us learned on the job, she said. The company ran training programs. 6 weeks of instruction, hands-on practice, then you're on the line. Some of the girls came from sewing factories, some from retail, some straight out of high school. Turns out building an airplane isn't so different from building anything else. You just need good instruction and practice. She tapped the schematic. This fuel system modification? We designed it here. Well, the engineers designed it, but we helped troubleshoot the installation process. Found 3 problems the original design hadn't accounted for. She returned to her work without waiting for a response, leaving Schreiber standing there with a disorientation so profound it felt almost physical. The casual competence, the absence of propaganda or performance. It was more devastating than any battlefield defeat because it suggested the war had been lost before it began, not through military failure but through fundamental miscalculation about what human beings were capable of achieving when given opportunity. The historical record of American women in wartime industry is vast and meticulously documented. By 1944, women constituted over 35% of the aviation industry workforce, a figure that exceeded 40% at facilities like Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed. They were not relegated to menial tasks. Women operated complex machinery, performed precision welding, conducted quality control inspections, and in some cases supervised entire assembly sections. Rosie the Riveter was not propaganda fiction. She was statistical reality multiplied across thousands of factories from Seattle to Long Island. The numbers were staggering in their implications. In 1943 alone, American factories produced 85,898 aircraft. In 1944, that number rose to 96,318. Germany, with its entire population mobilized for total war and millions of slave laborers pressed into service, produced 39,807 aircraft in 1944, less than half the American output despite fighting for its existence. The Soviet Union, with its factories relocated beyond the Urals and operating under siege conditions, produced 40,246 aircraft the same year. Together, the Allies outproduced the Axis powers by ratios that made industrial competition almost absurd. But statistics alone do not capture the ideological earthquake. The Third Reich had built its entire social structure on a foundation of racial and gender hierarchy. Women were mothers and homemakers. Their participation in public life was meant to be decorative or supportive, never essential. The Nazis had systematically removed women from universities, professions, and positions of authority, replacing them with propaganda about natural feminine roles. When the war began, this ideology did not bend, it intensified. Even as German factories faced catastrophic labor shortages, the regime resisted employing women in heavy industry, relying instead on slave labor from occupied territories. As late as 1943, German women's participation in the workforce was lower than it had been in 1939, a statistical impossibility that reflected ideological rigidity more than practical planning. Became a symbol the prisoners discussed late at night. They represented the thing Germany had never achieved: mobilization without social collapse. The Third Reich had promised total victory through total commitment, but that commitment had required draining every resource, militarizing every aspect of life, and ultimately failing to sustain either the military or the civilian population adequately. America, by contrast, had mobilized massively while maintaining enough economic elasticity that workers could still pack lunches, own cars, and plan for futures beyond the war. As winter turned toward spring and the war in Europe entered its final, convulsive phase, the prisoners at Camp Concordia received news in fragments. The Rhine crossed. Berlin surrounded. Hitler dead. Unconditional surrender. They gathered around the camp radio and listened to reports in English, translating for each other, trying to grasp the magnitude of the collapse. Some wept. Others sat in stunned silence. A few expressed relief that the dying was finally over. Schreiber listened to the BBC report the discovery of the concentration camps: Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. The descriptions were clinical at first, just statistics about the dead, but even statistics could not sanitize the horror. He had known, in the way soldiers know things they do not speak about, that something monstrous was happening in the East. There had been rumors, carefully sanitized Wehrmacht reports, the conspicuous absence of Jewish families from the towns they'd passed through during training. But knowing abstractly and hearing confirmation were different experiences. The regime he had served had not merely lost a war, it had committed atrocities so systematic and vast they defied comprehension. He thought about the woman who had offered him half a sandwich. He wondered if she had heard the news from Europe, if she understood what her work had helped defeat. He wondered if she hated him, or if she simply saw him as another human being caught in the machinery of history. He would never know. After the war, he would be repatriated to Germany, and she would continue her life in Kansas, and their brief intersection would become a memory neither could fully articulate. But standing there on the prairie, watching the light fade, Schreiber understood something that would shape the rest of his life. The war had not been lost because German soldiers lacked courage or skill. It had been lost because the society they defended was built on lies, about race, about gender, about human potential, about the sources of strength. The women in the factory had not defeated Germany through physical force. They had defeated it by existing, by demonstrating that the premises of National Socialism were false, that hierarchy based on arbitrary categories produced weakness rather than strength, and that a society which unleashed the talents of all its people would always overwhelm one that constrained half its population to decorative roles. It was a lesson purchased in blood, the blood of soldiers on every front, the blood of civilians in bombed cities, the blood of innocents murdered in camps whose names would become synonyms for evil. The women building bombers had not intended to teach this lesson. They had simply done their work, collected their wages, and gone home. But in doing so, they had changed the world in ways more profound than any battle plan or strategic doctrine. The epilogue belongs not to the prisoners or the women, but to history itself, the long arc of consequence that followed the war's end. The German prisoners eventually returned to a homeland that existed only in fragments, a landscape of rubble and trauma where the old ideologies had been buried beneath the evidence of their failure. Many struggled to reintegrate, haunted by what they had seen and what they had learned. Schreiber became a schoolteacher in Frankfurt, dedicating his life to ensuring German children learned history that was factual rather than mythological. Müller wrote a memoir in the 1960s detailing his experiences as a prisoner and the cognitive dissonance of watching women build the instruments of his nation's defeat. He titled it, "The Lunch Pail," a phrase that carried no meaning to readers who had not stood in that factory, but which contained for him the entire weight of his transformation. The women of the American home front, meanwhile, faced their own reckoning. When the war ended, they were expected to return to domestic roles, to surrender their factory jobs to returning servicemen, to resume lives that suddenly seemed smaller than the ones they had inhabited during mobilization. Many did so, constrained by social pressure and economic necessity. But something had changed, a recognition, however suppressed, that competence was not gendered, that women could perform any task given training and opportunity, and that relegating half the population to restricted roles was not natural law but social choice. The lunch pails ended up in attics and basements, forgotten relics of a moment that had seemed temporary but whose effects rippled forward through decades. The granddaughters would enter workplaces where gender restrictions had been systematically dismantled, not through sudden revolution but through incremental change built on foundations laid in factories during the war. The lunch pails themselves became artifacts, displayed in museums that tried to capture the texture of that moment when ordinary people had done extraordinary things simply because circumstances demanded it. There is a photograph taken at the Boeing plant in Wichita in December 1945, months after the war's end. It shows a nearly empty assembly line, the machinery silent, the work tables cleared. A single lunch pail sits on a stool in the foreground, abandoned or forgotten. The image is melancholy, capturing the end of an era and the uncertainty of what comes next. But it is also testament proof that the moment happened, that the women were real, that the transformation was genuine. The German prisoners who scoffed at American women workers had learned a truth more valuable than any military intelligence. That freedom is not weakness, that inclusion is not compromise, that societies which trust their citizens are more resilient than those which fear them. It was a lesson born in fire and assembly lines, in the click of rivet guns and the hum of hydraulic presses, in lunch pails carried by women who never imagined they were changing the world but who did so nonetheless through the simple act of competent labor. The bombers they built delivered destruction, but they also delivered a message, that the future would belong not to those who restricted human potential but to those who unleashed it. It was a message written in aluminum and steel, carried across oceans, and detonated over cities that had thought themselves invincible. And when the smoke cleared, the lesson remained, engraved not in monuments or manifestos, but in the quiet knowledge of prisoners who had watched their worldview crumble under the weight of evidence, and in the unspoken pride of women who had known all along what they were capable of achieving. The lunch pails are silent now, their owners gone, the factories repurposed or demolished. But the truth they represented endures, that abundance emerges from opportunity, that strength flows from inclusion, and that the measure of a civilization is not what it demands of its people but what it allows them to become.